Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great start to this week. I want to continue the series of videos I started back in January, where each month I try to focus on one of the essays from Ralph Waldo Emerson's first series of essays, published in the early 1840s, and going into sort of what are some key ideas he presents in the essay, are there any great one-liners or sort of like zingers that Emerson includes, and then trying to sort of evaluate the relevance of his ideas, particularly because there was a time where Emerson was one of the most influential thinkers in the United States. So how relevant, do his essays and his ideas remain here in 2021? And up next we have Compensation, which to my mind, in my reading, is maybe the single most underrated essay from the first series. I don't know that it's the strongest. That to me is probably Circles. We'll see at the end of this year. But I think Compensation might be the most underrated. Particularly, I think it compares favorably to both History and Self-Reliance, the first two essays. So, let's jump in. Here's how he starts. Ever since I was a boy, I have wished to write a discourse on compensation. For it seemed to me when very young that on this subject life was ahead of theology, and the people knew more than the preachers taught. And so this is, in that sentence, Emerson sort of makes a confession that is true about all of his essays. That his essays, his written essays, are a distillation of the public lectures he was giving. And those lectures were often consisted of ideas he had been working out in his journals, sometimes for years. And so these essays represent a really focused distillation of his thinking. And he goes on to describe how this specific essay and these ideas were stimulated by a sermon he heard, where the minister went into an idea, and it's an idea that people continue to discuss today around, evil people prosper in this life, and the saints suffer, good people suffer, so the compensation will be in the next life. There will be and really focus on, there will be a divine retribution for evil, in the afterlife. And Emerson kind of describes how he looks around and nobody questions this. And so he starts thinking about it, and this essay is the product. And he wants to question this idea, and he goes into a really interesting direction with it. He introduces an idea of what he described as polarity, and what I think we would refer to more as like duality or dualism now, or balance. That's another word he begins to use frequently throughout the essay. And he provides a list, and I mean 2 or 3 pages of specific examples of balanced duality, and he begins with very easy ones of like night and day, but hot and cold. But it goes into magnetism and the magnetic poles, and he works through numerous other examples, many drawn from nature. And so as he goes into this list, he introduces this idea. He goes, "Thus is the universe alive. All things are moral. That soul which within us is a sentiment, outside of us is a law. We feel its inspiration. Out there in history, we can see its fatal strength." And he's introducing this idea that the compensation is not later, that good and evil have this balance. And so if a person is doing evil, that person is introducing the evil into his or her own life. And then he goes on to say, and this is one of his stronger lines, "The dice of God are always loaded. The world looks like a multiplication table or a mathematical equation, which, turn it how you will, balances itself." And he's pushing at this idea. He wants us to agree with him in this idea of balance, that the good and evil are constantly in this balance. He goes on to say, "Crime and punishment grow out of one stem. Punishment is a fruit that unsuspected ripens within the flower of the pleasure that concealed it." And he's introducing an idea that we often, as humans, are trying to, we have what he refers to as the mind, or what the mind or soul wants and what the body wants. And that often, with something that we want, there's a consequence with that. Or something that can seem hard has a benefit to it. And we're always trying to separate those and tear them apart and only take, what our bodies want, or what the flesh wants, as he describes it, rather than understanding that we must have both. We must, embrace that balance. But I thought that punishment is fruit that unsuspected ripens within the flower of the pleasure that concealed it is one of the stronger lines. And he continues, "In nature, nothing can be given. All things are sold." This is that ancient doctrine of Nemesis who keeps watch in the universe and lets no offense go unchastised. And he mentions karma. He even specifically references Indian, as in South Asian beliefs. And he's introducing these ideas. He's trying to provide as many examples as he can from sort of the natural world to support his ideas. But then here's where Emerson hits, to me, one of the strongest pages in any of his essays. And this is where I start to feel compensation is really underrated. Emerson goes for some strong imagery here, and I think it works. All infractions of love and equity in our social relations are speedily punished. They are punished by fear. Well, what is fear? Fear is an instructor of great sagacity and the herald of all revolutions. One thing he teaches, that there is rottenness where he appears. He is a carrion crow, and though you see not well what he hovers for, there is death somewhere. That obscene bird is not there for nothing. He indicates great wrongs which must be revised. And you can imagine that line like coming out in a lecture, how he would draw on that, the imagery of this bird hovering around, you know, and everybody's terrified of him, trying to figure out what's going on. And he's very clear on this, that despite this idea of balance, there's something that must be revised, that a wrong that is introduced creates and can perpetuate wrong. So there has to be some revision. There has to be a revision to goodness and to correction. And I think that's one of those, you know, he introduces this proto-growth mindset idea where he describes people who have, you know, he goes on, you know, nothing is perfect. There's always this crack. And he mentions Achilles with the Achilles heel. He mentions Sigurd, where the leaf had fallen on him when he bathes in the dragon's blood. And that we all have this one weakness, but he describes how through that weakness we can actually grow and improve as people, which again is I think a fairly progressive and forward-thinking idea. He adds, the history of persecution is a history of endeavors to cheat nature. Keeps going back to that idea of nature. And then this is where he really takes flight, in that in the final couple pages, after he's given this whole essay on balance, this whole essay on compensation, this idea that it's not about divine retribution, it's retribution that is occurring right now. We're often just not realizing it. And that the fear that is introduced is much deeper than just a superficial fear of, you know, loss right here and right now that seems superficial. But here's where he really pushes at us a little bit. And it follows on that idea of there's a wrong that must be revised. He goes, the doctrine of compensation is not the doctrine of indifference. The soul is not a compensation but a life. The soul is. Under all this running sea of circumstance, whose waters ebb and flow with perfect balance, lies the aboriginal abyss of real being. In a virtuous act, I add to the world. I plant into deserts conquered from chaos and nothing, and see the darkness receding from the limits of the horizon. There can be no excess to love, none to knowledge, none to beauty, when these attributes are considered in the purest sense. The soul refuses limits and always affirms an optimism, never a pessimism. And so we have an optimistic Emerson. This is not the Emerson we often find, where he can really tear into society and tear into people. And of course, he started the essay with that. But he does bring us to a much more uplifting closure than he often does. And so again, I really find Compensation one of his more underrated essays. I'll have a link of the full text in the description box, along with our link for our next essay, which is Spiritual Lives? I believe it's Spiritual Lives. Spiritual Laws, sorry. Spiritual Laws will be up next. And in terms of some other, thinking, I mentioned, of course, that his journals often include these ideas in sort of their kernel form, and we get to see how the ideas evolve within Emerson. But I was thinking as I was reading it, particularly as I was waiting to get to that wrongs that must be revised, and the spirit of compensation is not indifference, just blithely waiting for nature to rebalance itself. I was thinking, of course, of some of the writings and speeches and sermons from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his idea of, the arc of history bends towards justice, but arcs exist because there's a force operating on them, and forces need to operate to bend history towards justice. particularly in some of the last year's sermons from 1967 and 1968, like Where Do We Go From Here? A Time to Break Silence. I was also thinking of some of Nathaniel Hawthorne's writings, particularly the Scarlet Letter, and some of the ideas of nature that exist within the Scarlet Letter, and also that idea of the punishment being within the fruit of pleasure as it ripens and is disguised, and kind of thinking of Roger Chillingworth and Reverend Dimsdale within that perspective. The passage there about, drawing, expanding the horizon against chaos and nothing, reminds me quite a bit of the beginning and end of one of the Elric books by Michael Moorcock, the Weird of the White Wolf, the third book in the Elric saga. And then, as I had mentioned, Emerson, of course, made some references to concepts of karma from Indian thinking, but he also has sections that do seem to follow from Lucretius and Epicurus, and some of his ideas around swerve and around balance that feel like he had read Lucretius. So this was Compensation. Let me know what you think. Again, I'll put a full text of the essay in so anybody can read it if you haven't had a chance to, and I really do hope you're having a great week. Thanks.